hello.
I didn't think it was going to start.
I was wondering there too for a second. Kept loading. But hello. Welcome back. We're digging back into the text this week. We're a little bit later this week because the early part of this week was just busy on my end.
Yes.
So
all
we
the
weren't
shut-in services.
Yep. So I go around town and do shut-in services, and Monday I had like two of them, I think, or something like that.
Yeah.
And yesterday I had 3, so it's just kind of hard to kind of get together to do a video. But we're back. We're into the Bible this week. We have our scroll in front of us, which we will talk more about in a second. But what's our reading plan for the week here?
This week is Psalm 82 to 84, Proverbs 21 to 24, and 1 Chronicles 13 through 29, and then beginning 2 Chronicles 1 through 2.
All right.
So we're going to cover 1 Chronicles today because we actually started reading it last week, but we talked about Philippians last week. So
Right.
Going to try to do all 1 Chronicles in 1 week and all 2 Chronicles in 1 week.
Do our best. Why read Chronicles?
It's a retelling of the story.
Exactly. Why read it, right? I think that's probably, I heard that a lot when I first read the Bible. When you get the Chronicles, you're thinking, oh, what's going to be in this book? And you're like, wait a minute. Because when you read through Chronicles, it's a repeat of a story.
But it is also different. It has a different emphasis.
It does. The book of Chronicles, because we're getting into Chronicles today.
I mean, the Bible it all does repeat,
It does.
Actually.
Well, and it echoes all the time.
Yeah.
And this is echoing. But a lot of scholars, readers of the Bible, they either will skip over this or they'll diminish the book of Chronicles for many reasons. And they don't find much worth in this book.
I think this one's actually more helpful than Kings is, actually. Samuel and Kings in a way.
Yeah. And we'll get into that 'cause there is a lot of good material in here. Some people do suspect it because of how it presents David. But, we'll get into all of that here. Yeah. And there's a reason for that. So, when you read through Chronicles, maybe what are some things that stick out to you as you read the book?
There's a lot of names.
Okay. 9
first
chapters.
9 chapters are genealogies and names after name after name that I cannot pronounce.
And that's strike one with Chronicles, right? It's a repeat of information we've already read about. There's some new stuff and there's some gems, but for a lot of people, they're like, okay, it's a repeat, and then you get to the first 9 chapters and you're just reading name after name after name. So there's another strike on it. So Chronicles is maybe a hard book to get into, but and as we'll get into it more here today and next week, I enjoy Chronicles from the fact of when you understand where it's coming from, who's writing it, who would be reading it at this point, and some of the stories it does focus in on, because it focuses on stories for a reason. And we'll get into all of that here today.
I noticed it focuses a lot on the temple.
It does, and there's a reason for that. And
it has anything to do with when it was written?
And when it was written. So when was it written, Dana?
Wasn't it written at the end of the exile or just after they got back?
Yeah, so maybe this is Ezra, maybe it's one of the prophets like Haggai, Zechariah writing it down,
Because Ezra, I think it's Ezra, probably would be my guess.
Scribe,
because 2 Chronicles ends the same way Ezra starts, and Ezra is also the focus on the rebuilding of the temple, which we'll talk about Ezra in a few weeks, but since it's focused so much on how the first temple was built, it would make sense that they're writing this while they're about to rebuild the second temple.
So if you've been tracking, you've been watching us here, the story of the people of God, God brought them out of Egypt, He put them in the promised land. They're His people, He's made the covenant with them. And then as they're in the promised land, the people do not keep covenant. They break the covenant with God, the contract, right, you could say. Maybe in our terms to understand it better, they don't keep faith, and so God keeps up His end of the bargain by sending them into exile. So
He enacts the penalties of the contract.
Yep. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. It's like in the fine print it said if you do this, this, and this, then you are hereby subject to these type of charges, and
which kind of that's in Deuteronomy. There's the
exactly.
blessings and
you have a thought on that too.
Yes, I do. But
yeah,
we can get to that in a little bit too.
Yeah. So Chronicles is written after the exile, right? So the people go into exile for 70 years, so almost a couple generations, and then they get brought back home. And as they're coming home, this is a small group of people who have now been away from the promised land for 70. Most of them do not have memories of even ever living in the promised land, but they know the history, they know where they came from, they know who they are as a people, and now they've been told to go home. And as this people, they want to reclaim their identity. They want to remind themselves of who they are and where they've come from, because as they go into the future, they need that anchor and that tether in the past to be able to figure out the direction that they needed to go. And so First Chronicles and Second Chronicles is written from the standpoint of a people who are trying to remember who they are and not forget, because they're looking back at their past and they're seeing, this is how we came to this point. Here's why we had to go into exile. And as we come back, we need to remind ourselves of how we should not go into exile again and not lose all that we're gaining again. Because, coming back from the exile, it was the threat where you're going to seek me in exile and you're going to come back. And that's kind of where
it ends.
Kind of the story ends. And so now as we get to this story, they're retelling it and they're kind of hoping that there's now going to be a future of the story.
Which the story is not completed in the Old Testament.
Right. The story doesn't have an ending.
Because Ezra and Nehemiah do kind of just end, and you're like...
Right. Which, the order of our Bibles, this comes after 1st and 2nd Kings, right? Because we usually put all the history stuff together and the poetic stuff we put together. We don't put it chronologically. Well, the Hebrews, when they put their Hebrew Bible together, the Hebrew Bible ends with 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It's how the story ends. Which, when you get to the end of 2nd Chronicles, it's Cyrus's proclamation of go home. And so their story ends with, we're going home, and now we need to wait for God to act again. And, so that's kind of where they leave. And that's where, in the Hebrew mindset of the Bible, that's where their story ends. For us as Christians, we end with my messenger is coming in Malachi, and which is a great spot to end. But for theirs, we're going up to Jerusalem, and now we need to wait for God's action again, his redemption. The king, which we wait for too. So that's some of the structure and background of the book. But any other thoughts you're thinking there?
Well, I have my, theory about how this kind of is a repetitive. Chronicles is kind of like Deuteronomy in terms of the story, because you have the people were in the wilderness for 40 years. The people all died off, kind of like in the exile, where you have no living memory. Deuteronomy is the retelling of the story, basically, the law. They enter, and then you got Joshua and Judges, which is the reclaiming conquering the promised land, and then you got Ezra and Nehemiah, which are they're reclaiming the promised land, rebuilding the temple, and then, so after you get Joshua and Judges, then the kings come. You get David, whereas after Ezra and Nehemiah, now you're waiting for the king to come, which the next step would be Jesus coming.
Right.
So this is kind of a little bit, because the Bible does kind of circle around its own story several times, as we've talked about a little bit, and so that's what this just strikes me, because it's a retelling of what already was told, whereas Deuteronomy was a retelling of Exodus, Numbers, and what am I missing? Leviticus.
Yes.
I'm missing one. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers is Deuteronomy's retelling those, whereas Chronicles is retelling basically 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings.
Right.
So.
Yeah, so it's this is 4 books rolled into 2 books,
basically,
which is fun.
It does cut out some stuff, but
it does, and it adds some stuff in there too from other stuff that we don't know.
That we were reading First or Samuel and Kings, and you're like, wait, when did this happen? And now we have more, or why did this happen? And we have actually a little more detail now.
And Chronicles is going to focus in on the kingship, but more so the temple. That the promise of the temple gives of God's presence, which that
if they're about to rebuild the temple,
right? They want to remind themselves.
Just rebuilt the temple, maybe, depending on when it was written. But.
And they remember how the old temple was filled with pagan sacrifices, and it went astray. And so they want to retell the story, and they're trying to say, hey, when we were faithful to the worship in the temple and the structure that God had given and the covenant that he provided there that was exercised in the temple, things went well. And we'll see that with each of the kings, especially in 2nd Chronicles, that the kings that do really well are kings that pay attention to the temple, who, honor the temple, who, either help out rebuilding the temple or fixing it, or telling the Levites, make sure you do your job in the temple, right, and order it well, which we'll see with David here, because David spends a ton of time in this book organizing the structure of their worship and how it should be done.
And collecting the materials for the temple.
Yeah, so a huge, where 1st and 2nd Kings and Samuel do not do this. Chronicles pulls together and it focuses on the life and the worship of their people and how they should recapture this. This is ours.
Because Samuel and Kings are more about almost the political side of things a little more.
Yeah.
Like they went off and fought this war and fought that person, and
there's a lot of that.
There's a lot more of that. That's what. Yeah, this is a lot more.
Yeah.
Worship.
Chronicles is a more liturgical book. We would say. Yeah, maybe it's just why for some people it's not a strike against it because it's not not thrilling.
Yeah.
But for them, this is their lifeblood. This is how they have communion with God. So Chronicles is an important book. So how about we go through some major sections of it? We'll read through our genealogy because we have between us today our the genealogies. This has been stuff when they were coming back from exile or important things. They would have their scrolls with them. They'd have whole jars set aside to have their important documents, their legal documents, their census. You had to find yourself on the sheet here to be considered a priest.
I was going to say the genealogies were really important, especially for the Levites, because it was certain families were the ones who did certain things in the temple, like only descendants of Aaron could be priests, and so you had to know. I think isn't it in Second Chronicles or Ezra and Nehemiah? One of them where there's a list of a few people who they couldn't find them
prove
prove that they were Levites, and so
they couldn't be priests.
And so you had to prove, and that also was like where you could get your land and all that stuff. Genealogies were really important to them.
They told you who you are.
Yeah,
and they're your pedigree.
We have a tendency to. There are still people nowadays who do. I look. Discovering my family history. We found some genealogies that go all the way back to the mid 1400s in my family. Cool. That it's like where they kind of were living. I know where in Germany some of my family came from. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I have it written down somewhere. And it's interesting because it kind of tells you who you are.
And they're remembering because Old Testament does this all the time. When we read these genealogies, they can be a little on the dry side and things. But for them, this is them tracing the lineage and the promises of God, right? What God had spoken to each of these family members, right, to Abraham. And it was so important to be a part of Abraham's offspring because through them, all nations are going to be blessed. So that was something that you would keep track of, right? Now that we live in the New Testament, right, the promise of Jesus has come through the tracing of this promise. So we don't need to trace it anymore. But it is important as we look back at these texts to say, this is how we get to Jesus.
Well, and this also grounds this in history, too.
Right.
Because, Chronicles starts all the way back to Adam.
Adam,
And lists all the way down, through Noah and Abraham.
So if you cut out those first few, then you're cutting out everything else. The tree is dead at the root if you cut out Adam.
So it's the history as written in the Bible. It's important to believe it because you do have unintended consequences of cutting out the promise. That's a lot of the Old Testament is tracing the promises. So if you start trying to cut out parts of it, you're cutting out parts of the promise.
Exactly. And that's why we argue for Adam. Because here's Jesus and here's who he is, and therefore, it stems to Adam.
And this isn't the only. One of Jesus' genealogies goes all the way back to Adam too.
Luke does too. Yeah. It's fascinating. Like you said, this is stuff that happened in real time to real people, and this is tracing God's interaction with these people. That's important. That's important for us too. When we stop to think about the work that God's given to us in our baptism, that's tracing that promise too. And our life, we see where God has then interacted and fulfilled His word to us, where He's spoken to us these promises in baptism. It's reflected every time we confess our sins, every time we sit at the table at the altar of our Lord. Right, we are reminded that this is part of who we are as well. That this story is now our story. That His life is our life, and it's routinely doing this, and this is what they're doing too.
And some of the names are actually interesting because you see, you have Edom, the Edomites. Those show up. Canaan, the Canaanites. Those are all descendants of him. Even some of these I've seen here, Ophir and Havilah. Isn't Havilah where there was gold, or Ophir was where there was gold?
Havilah in Genesis 2.
So one of them must have. Havilah. He must have settled wherever land there was gold, and
was named gold.
There's some of these where it's like, some of the names actually show up in places and people groups, and they're actually, so it's kind of interesting.
There's always some of the tidbits that you can get in the genealogies here. Like chapter 1, verse 19. He had that Eber was born 2 sons. His name of the first was Peleg, and for in his days the earth was divided. Like, what does that mean exactly, that the earth was divided? Some people think this when the gods, nations split across. Some people think it's maybe when the continents drifted.
Some people think this might have been Babel, where everyone was
scattered.
Yeah.
So you get little tidbits like that where you don't get much on it. You're like, huh, what does that mean? But you do get those lines here every once in a while. Let's see if there's anything that sticks out. So the tracing of the promise begins with Adam, right? Because it all starts with Adam. And then it goes to Abraham. And remember in Genesis chapter 12 how Abraham then received that promise from God. He was given the promise of Isaac. And so end of chapter 1 kind of continues with that. And it kind of catches it up. And then in chapter 2 we get to David, right? So the promises that given to David. So the major themes in the scripture from Adam to Abraham to King David, right? So we're tracing these major players in the entire Old Testament who are given select and very directed promises from God about what he was going to do for them and the salvation he was going to bring. Adam, right? To Adam and Eve, you can the picture of the stamping on the serpent's head, of crushing the serpent. So that's tying to that promise. Abraham, right? Through you, all nations on earth will be blessed. Well, that's a big promise. David, through one of your sons will sit in the throne forever, right? Those are huge promises that God's making. And so the first 2 chapters are tracing those out, getting those done. You get the descendants of David, so it's tracing the Davidic line again. We see how important that is. And
it sort of repeats a little bit, right?
Yeah, it does do.
The descendants of all the different Israelites.
Right.
So it focuses on David because it's focusing on the promise, and then it goes back and covers all the other.
Yeah, and if I'm remembering here correctly, 3:19, there it is. It continues up. So, and the sons of Penadayas, Zerubbabel and Shimi. So we get post-exile. So we know this is written after the exile because it tells us names and descendants of those who came back home after the exile. So that's how we know that this is from that time.
So this would be the king line then.
Yep. So that's tracing who is, and we pick this up in the New Testament a little bit too by tracing a few of them here as well. A few of them are highlighted. So we're tracing then the promise of the Davidic line because they're still hoping that this is, the kingship comes from David. And Chronicles, even though it doesn't really focus in on a Davidic Messiah, it focuses a lot on the priests in the temple. And it will talk about God and Messiah as being priest-like, which is where we get Jesus as priest too. But it doesn't lose track. It will say in there, but the promise of kingship was given to David. So it does mention it still, but there is not a lot of focus in on the Davidic line of the Messiah coming through the Davidic line anymore. Even though they know that's where the hope comes from, they don't really focus on that in Chronicles. They focus on the priesthood and the temple, which is what they're doing in their day as well.
Yeah, they're rebuilding the temple, so...
Yeah. Anything that you see is interesting about the genealogies or anything weird that just kind of sticks out to you about them?
Well, I know there's some, they get into a little bit of, Edom and stuff.
Yeah.
Some of that.
Outside family members, yeah.
Yeah, they'd be the cousins of the Israelites, basically.
And that might be of use for them if they are trying to say, who are those Edomites, right? How are they related? Because if they're coming back to the promised land, those people also might still be kind of in the area too. And so they have to kind of make sure they know who they are as well. And how do you interact with the people around you? So you get the major tribes here, right? Chapter 4 is Judah. You get the descendants of Judah and Simeon and Reuben in chapter 5. Gad, Manasseh, Levi.
Which Naphtali gets one line.
One line? That's a good question. Maybe there wasn't many children of Naphtali who came back following the exile.
True, because this is largely just those who were in the southern kingdom, and so southern kingdom was largely Judah, and there would have been other. Which this is proof that some people in the northern kingdom did survive by probably going to the southern kingdom.
Yeah.
Some of them escaped after the northern kingdom was taken into exile, weren't they, or something?
Right. Yeah, some of them migrate, which we hear in Chronicles, some of them do migrate down south. But we find out that one line of Naphtali there, the descendants of Bilhah there, which is one of Jacob's servants, the maid servants there. We don't get too much on that tribe, just a brief line. But then you get Manasseh, there's Issachar and Benjamin too, Ephraim, Asher. So it's just recounting all of the tribes and it's giving their legitimacy.
And there's random stories too in the midst of some of this. So that's why you should just totally skip. I mean, I know it's hard to read every single name, but at least, there's some interesting random little stories too that go on.
Right.
So.
Yeah. And then, of course, you get to catch up, because the story begins in Chronicles with the death of Saul. And so when you start there, you got to say, okay, who is Saul again? And so chapter 8 does the genealogy of Saul, catches up with the first king there. And then chapter 9 then, it ends with here are the exiles. So it connects them to the overall picture and the overall story. It's kind of their continuing on the legacy here. So those who are coming back home from the exile, here's who they are, here's what they did, here's what they're in charge of, all that stuff.
The Levites, who was in charge of which tribe was, or which clan, I guess, was in charge of which part of the temple.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, like we said, it's just connecting them to the larger story, and that they're a part of this too. And that's for our day, we should make sure that we're connecting ourselves to the larger story, that we're not a segmented, we're not our own time and our own culture, but we're connected to a larger picture, to a larger church that spans not just here in Marshfield or even all across the world, but throughout all time. These are also our descendants, our ancestors.
We should never think of ourselves as an isolated congregation.
Right.
Because, we'd be cutting ourselves off from the rest of the body.
Right.
Yeah.
Like one day you are going to meet Shalom, who is the gatekeeper. We're going to meet that guy one day. So these are people who you're going to meet in heaven one day.
Yeah.
And you're going to have to learn how to pronounce their names.
Hopefully that comes naturally. And I always find it funny when, we're reading the Bible, like Bible study or at council or something, and we're trying to,
pronounce some of these.
When you ever get to a passage that has all the names, you always feel bad for the person, because usually, actually, the trick is to just say it and no one else will know.
Confidently say it, and you're like, I guess that's how you say it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, if you're confident about it, no one else will. Some of them you just have to kind of sound out a little bit and you go with it. And I've heard like 5 different pronunciations for some common names, actually. So
right.
Who knows?
And even they probably had multiple ways of saying it too. So.
Yeah, there's certain languages that you can say the same word like multiple different ways, and no one knows what the right way is.
Right. Yeah. So once you get through all of these genealogies, then right, you find out who all these people are. You hear the little tidbits, maybe the little stories about them. You connect yourself to the bigger picture. You finally get to chapter 10, and it picks up maybe in a weird, we would think it's a weird spot, but where does it start off with in chapter 10?
It starts with Saul and his sons dying.
Yeah, which is kind of once again a weird place to start. But if you're remembering, they start off with this story of failure and see this is why this failed. A big theme in the book of Chronicles is breaking faith. Breaking the covenant.
So Saul died for his breach of faith?
Yep, because I think that's how it goes, doesn't it?
Yeah, chapter 10:13, it says, so Saul died for his breach of faith. He broke faith with the Lord in that he did not keep the command of the Lord, and also consulted a medium seeking guidance. He did not seek guidance from the Lord. Therefore the Lord put him to death and turned the kingdom over to David and David the son of Jesse.
Yep. So it tells you already off the top of the head, like, here's the first story that we're going to tell in our history, and this will tell you how the rest of the time should be judged.
First I guess Chronicles, I should probably not just say First Chronicles, because this is like in Samuel and Kings, where
it's all one
Samuel
scroll.
It's Kings, it's Chronicles. It's not like separate written, it's just how it was on the scrolls. But it's almost like a commentary on Samuel and Kings, because it does kind of really, like this little passage, it just kind of is like, okay, here's why
that happened. Here's why Saul died.
A little later here we get more about why David got into trouble with the census and stuff. It's more of a commentary on explaining, okay, this was the reason behind some of this, maybe.
Yeah. That's good. That's a good point. Yeah.
Is that more theological?
It is, which it tells you, and this is a big thing when you read the scriptures too, because sometimes you're like, Solomon had all these wives. You're like, what? And the scripture doesn't really give you a commentary too much on it. Just tells you. Chronicles does more of a, we'll tell you exactly what this means. And so that is kind of helpful when you read Chronicles. But after chapter 10, you do get into David.
Yep.
And he's pretty much the rest of First Chronicles is all about David. For the most part. Solomon comes in at the end. But the big focus for the rest of First Chronicles is on David's reign and his line and what he did. And you'll notice there's a few omissions throughout here. What do you notice in...
a couple of his sins, like Bathsheba?
Yeah, Bathsheba is not mentioned at all. It's mentioned in passing. It says that David kept faith perfectly, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. And that's all it says about it, right? So it assumes we know that this happened, but it it purposefully leaves that telling of it out. Why do you think? If you had to kind of give a reason, why would Chronicles hide that? It's not, is it trying to hide dirty secrets and things like that?
Well, considering it does mention it, it's not exactly trying to hide it.
Right.
I guess it's not the focus.
Right.
David isn't really the focus here, maybe.
Yeah. And who are they trying to set David up to be?
Christ-like figure?
Yeah, right. So they're not trying to hide David's sins because he doesn't have them. We're just trying to pretend it didn't happen. But they're trying to uplift David, saying, this is the model king here. If you want good kingship, you need to follow these examples.
Except for that one incident.
Right. So it doesn't drag and explain that one because it's like, we already know that's not what we want you to do anyway. We want you to focus on what David did here and why he was faithful in this matter. So it does put him up as a Christ-like figure.
They already had kings in the records there.
And they knew, yeah.
So it's not like, it's obviously a story that's known.
Right.
You don't need to repeat it.
Yep. Yeah, so it's just trying to keep tabs with, here's David as he is this messianic figure, and here's how all the kings should be judged after this too. So it's really just setting David up as the example to follow, because Jesus hasn't come yet. There is no perfect human being. So David is as close as you're going to get, even though he himself is very far from that fact. But they're looking for the David who is to come. They know from the prophets, from Jeremiah and Isaiah and Amos and all of them, Micah, that there is going to be a new David that's coming. So literally they are writing David as a new David and leaving out the old. So they're trying to exemplify here. This is going to be the David that's to come. This is what he's going to be like. And that's an important part to keep in mind too. Because all the other kings in 2nd Chronicles are kind of judged based on David. They did just like what David did. Or they didn't. And we see how well that goes for them. So good. So that's, it starts off with David becoming king and anointed. He takes Jerusalem, and what else there?
There's all of his mighty men, again.
Yeah. That's all of them listed out there.
Yeah. Some of these are kind of funny, because it has the 3 mighty men or whatever, but this one was but then this one was the leader of the mighty men, but was it, or was it the 3 and... Anyway,
wait,
it's like all these weird, and then this one actually made more renown than the 3 or something.
But did not achieve to the mighty men.
And all these interesting stories. The really tall Egyptian. And
chapter 11, verse 24 there. These things did Benaniah, the son of Jehoiada, and one a name besides the 3 mighty men. He was renowned among the 30, but he did not attain to the 3. Yeah, so you just kind of, the great deeds of David's faithful bodyguards and, military men and things like that. And, these are kind of like the Navy SEALs here for David. Yeah. They're the guys that take care of business. So it kind of lists them out, those who joined with David. And we see that, those who are faithful always have people who gather around them and things like that too. More of that. Chapter 12 does that. I might skip the page here. Let me flip back. You get through all that. Chapter 12. Anything else that you kind of see as you push forward? What does David start doing once he's established as king?
Is that when he brings the ark?
Yep.
Oh, yeah. Is that the next thing on here?
Yep.
Yeah. That's the whole story of bringing the ark back to, where was it put here? It's not Jerusalem yet, is it?
Is that chapter 13, verse 5 there? He assembled all those from the Nile of Egypt to Lebo Hamath to bring the ark of God from Kiriath Jearim. So that's where the ark has been at this entire time.
Yeah. There's more story about why Uzzah got into trouble.
Right.
It actually says in here, again, a commentary on the text, because, Uzzah died because he touched the ark, and there was something in here, maybe it's a little later. He didn't take the ark home. I think it's later when he finally does bring the ark. It says that then they carried it like it was actually prescribed or something.
Yeah.
I can't find it now.
Well, I'm sure it'll run across.
Anyway, basically that, they weren't doing it correct the first time, and it actually explains that. It doesn't really explain that when the story is in Samuel.
Yeah, it just kind of describes it.
Yeah, and you can assume, but yeah, later it's in here somewhere. Oh, here it is, I think. Chapter 15, verse 5. 13. Because you did not carry it the first time, the Lord our God broke out against us because we did not seek him according to the rule.
Okay.
So the priests and the Levites consecrated themselves to bring the ark up.
And that's another big important thing. We already see here when you approach God, for them, that you have to do it prescribed to the rule, right? The rule that God had prescribed in the Torah, in the teaching.
You can't just go up
to God. Yep, that's dangerous.
That's something we forget about in the church nowadays, I think, is that because we have this lovey-dovey, fuzzy form, Jesus,
right.
And so we think, oh yeah, anyone can just approach God. God is safe. And it's like, God's
far from it.
Not safe. There is still a way to approach God.
Respect him.
And it's through Jesus.
Right.
But it's...
Yeah, he's the access to getting. People try to find God outside of Christ.
Yeah.
They're treading on something that they need to be careful about. Because they're not coming to God respectfully or according to the rule. And without consecrating themselves.
We want to talk about closed communion. There's a reason that we don't just let anyone up to the Lord's table, because approaching God and coming, God coming to you is a dangerous thing, and it can harm you if you do it incorrectly.
Our small catechism, right? The words "for you" require all hearts to believe, right? So if you don't come to God by faith, you can only encounter God in wrath.
Yeah.
You'll never find God according to his promise or mercy if you do not come by faith in Christ. Right? Not in a faith that's not just vague and, I have magic feeling faith, whatever like that, but a faith in an object, in Jesus. So that's an important thing too. So, so good. So we find out here early on as well that what's going to be important in the book of Chronicles is the king, prescribing right worship in the in the temple, and setting up who's going to be doing it and all of that. How do you honor God and his holiness and the gifts that he's given, that he is now dwelling among us. And that's big for the Levites and the Judahites and the days of the post-exile as well. So good. Anything else that you kind of see with the ark being brought in, or anything that kind of just sticks out to you?
Well, there's a lot more detail than there was, but
right. Yeah, and that is the fun thing about Chronicles when you read it, is that though you're like, I read this before, you're like,
it's filling in the gaps.
Oh yeah. A lot of stuff that we wouldn't know.
I feel a little bit, it's kind of like where people freak out about the four Gospels, that John is so much different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Right.
But John was probably written a lot later, and so John is filling in the gaps that the other three did. I mean, he repeats some of the stories, but you get more random, in-between detail from John. It's kind of like this, where in Chronicles you get kind of a little bit of the in-between detail.
And that's... Well, they help supply information. Some we wouldn't know other things about the Gospels if it wasn't for this detail or that detail. We wouldn't know the servant's name who's got his ear cut off by Peter was Malchus. We wouldn't know if we only have one Gospel that it was Peter that cut off the guy's ear. So they kind of help fill in details, and that's what eyewitnesses do, right? There's other things that they saw and they remember that they bring to the table that kind of make a more full picture.
Well, so that's what we have to remember. The Bible isn't just... It's not one book.
Right.
It is, it's, people think, the Torah is repetitive, the first 5 books, because you get, Genesis and Exodus, but then Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy all repeat, but it's giving you different detail, and it's those were all written by Moses, but, like Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles were all written by different people at different times, and so you are getting a different perspective of the events. So it actually verifies that the events actually happened. Right.
Yeah.
It's not just a carbon copy cookie cutter.
If you had Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that said the exact same thing, was the exact same word, you'd be more like, that's suspicious. Right? But the fact that they give the same story, but they give different angles and lenses on it, tells you that these are, true stories. Yeah. That's how if you talk to police officers when they do eyewitness things, right? They'll pull people apart who are witnesses, and they'll question them separately, because they know if they put them together, they'll say, oh yeah, that's what I saw too. But if they get them separately, they'll be able to find the different details.
It doesn't mean that anyone's lying. It just means they saw it differently.
Yep, and they can put the picture together and solve what actually happened. Some people do that with the Gospels too, right? They'll put them together and they'll say, this is the tomb was empty on Easter. That's what we get out of that.
Whereas some people freak out that, this says this, and then, there were 2 angels, but that one said there was only 1 angel, and it's like, it's different,
Right.
We can get to that when we get to the Gospels.
That's true.
When we do videos on the Gospels.
We'll have fun with those.
So anyway, so First Chronicles is from the post-exile perspective.
Yep.
It's further evidence that that King David did actually exist, because for a while people didn't think King David existed, but we have 3 different records here of his history.
David. Yeah. And that and we have there's a piece of archaeological find. It's called the Tel Dan Inscription. And you've probably heard of that. It's just that where it actually details the house of David.
Yeah.
And so we can tell that there was someone who, just from archaeological evidence.
And it wasn't just this backwater. Israel wasn't just this backwater thing too. I know there's some some people are like, oh, well, it must just have been a small kingdom, and there's evidence that actually wasn't ties that.
Right. It describes in the Bible here.
Yeah. Anyway.
So finally the ark is put into a tent, right? It's David has a song of praise and thanks, which is it one of the Psalms?
It's one of the Psalms because of
Psalm
thanks to the
105.
Lord, call upon his name, make known his deeds among the people isn't that the Old Testament canticle in our service of prayer and preaching in our
let's see, 16.
I think that's that one.
8 through 22. It says see notes, but it says Psalm 105 verses 1 through 15. So this is Psalm 105.
Okay.
So once the ark has been given a place of rest, this is the psalm that David says concerning it. Then we get worship before the ark, right? So this is, like we already kind of mentioned, right? Chronicles is a book of worship, of liturgical rites and ceremony, of how the people of God, now this is theirs, and we need to look at the past and see how it was done to kind of do it.
Make sure we're doing it right.
Right.
Because we did it wrong, and that's how we got into
kicked
exile.
Out. Yeah. Because we broke the ark, we broke the covenant with God and kicked us out. So let's make sure we don't do that this time. And we worship and fear only Him. So you get the worship before the ark. So David, he comes before and worships God. And then pushing forward then into chapter 17 is the retelling of 2 Samuel 7. So God makes the promise with David, right, that he would have a son that reigns on the throne forever. And here that's repeated here too. Yep. Did you notice anything else different about that telling, or is it just kind of do a good job of retelling the story?
I thought there were a couple things different, but now I can't remember what they were.
Yes, I remember too.
I don't think it was anything major. It's just like a little bit extra detail or something.
Right. Yeah, but it's the same promise that gets established that God's going to make out of David's line a king who will reign forever. And this is important for the exiles coming back, because they're all from the tribe of Judah. They remember. They have David's line recorded here, and they're trying to remember, from one of these guys is going to come a king. And so there's still kind of that hope, even though now they're being ruled by the Persians, and soon in a few decades it's going to be the Greeks, and then it'll turn into the Romans, and
they just keep getting ruled by everyone else.
Right. The new neighbor comes in, the new tenant comes in, and kind of the new landlord maybe of the tenant comes in and takes charge of things. It's under new management. But they're always waiting at the end of the Old Testament approaches for that king to come. And so we see that here. Chapter 18, David defeats his enemies. You get how David administers, how he reigns, how he organizes things there at the end of chapter 18 as well. And you can get more of that here before the end. The book is done. But we get more of David's deeds, the Ammonites here who disgraced David's men, and his response.
That's still a slightly funny story.
Yeah. What do you notice about it?
Just the men being embarrassed with where they cut their pants between their buttocks or whatever. It's just kind of funny, actually.
A story that, if you knew that you were going to be put into the Bible one day, what story would you want to find yourself in? Would you want to be David's mighty men or the poor guys who are disgraced and have their clothes cut in half?
It's one of those funny stories.
You're gonna meet those guys in heaven one day. So, you're that guy, and you'd be like, yeah, that's me. Good stuff. So you get how David is faithful, how he conquered. He creates space and peace for the people of Israel. He defeats their enemies, right? Which for them to call back, they're under foreign domination. And so to hear this and be like, the David who's going to come is going to grant us this peace too.
Is this where the Jews in Jesus' day get the idea of he's going to overthrow the Romans?
Yep.
Oh.
This is part of where that thinking comes from. And you get that a little bit in Zechariah too.
Okay. Yeah, so they're seeing it as the human way of overthrowing governments.
And they don't see him as a type of Christ, type of David to come.
Yeah, it's more like a metaphor of what Jesus is going to do.
Right. Jesus does fight our enemies of sin, death, and the power of the devil, right? Those are our enemies that Jesus comes to fight, our true enemies.
Aren't flesh and blood, but the powers and principalities of, however that verse goes, the spiritual realm.
Right. Or that reign over this present dark. Those are our enemies. And so David's going to come, will fight those and put those under submission to him. And that's, so hearing that, it's good news. Oh, the Messiah is going to come, is going to put our enemies under our feet. You just got to understand, what are those enemies? Who are those enemies?
So these enemies are representative of the actual enemies.
Right.
So is it kind of, so it's like in the prophets, like in Joel, where he uses the locusts to...
as a springboard.
As like, that's an army. And anyway, if you want to learn about the book of Joel, since we haven't gotten to that one yet, the word of the Lord endures forever.
Yeah, it's a good podcast. He's been doing a good job.
Talking about Joel right now, but locust.
But that point still stands. So here, when you get like the Philistine giants being killed, David and Goliath, and you go back to that story, the Goliath is a type of enemy of the people of God, and who is our enemy that taunts us, that accuses us, is Satan. And Jesus comes to throw down his accusations and to silence him, and to just as Goliath got his head cut off, so too does Christ come to cut off the head of the serpent. To crush his head. And so that's what Jesus, our Lord, does too.
But that does make a lot more sense about why the Jews were thinking that Jesus was going to be this great
military power.
Because they were thinking he was David, where instead of thinking of David like Jesus, they were thinking of Jesus like David. Yeah. They had backwards.
Right. Yep. That's a good way to put it. You get military conquest in 19 and 20 here. David's faithfulness and all that, and then you get to 21,
which is we get further detail of what is that at the end of 2 Samuel, that we get that odd epilogue kind of about the census, and you're kind of like, this gives you more detail about exactly how it went about and what was going on, and that it was a sin of pride,
right? Yeah,
because David basically wanted to number all the Israelites.
Yep. And this is, here the difference here is some people will kind of note this too, how 2 Samuel ends with this story and how 1 Chronicles 21 tells it. You have different people inciting David. So we're told that God incited David, against, it's kind of like God had a hand in it. But here we're said, Satan stood against Israel and incited David to do this. And so people are always like, well, who was it? Was it Satan that caused David to, do this? Or
is this like in the book of Job when it's Satan doing this stuff against Job, but God let him, kind of thing?
That's kind of the thought that 2 Samuel tells us of God was the one. So it's not like God's like, oh, this happened. He was the one directing it, right? Saying, test him. But Satan was the tool that God used to do it, to incite.
He used it to humble David.
Right. So just like Job, how God's like, yeah, sure, go ahead and afflict Job, and Satan's just the tool for the job that came from the Lord. But that's what's the famous line? Luther says this, that the devil is the devil, but he is God's devil. I like that line, that he's still, God has uses for him, and then once he's done with him, he'll cast him aside for good, and we won't be bothered by him again. Nor will David be bothered by him again. So we get the retelling of the story, the David taking a census, which was against what God wanted to be done. And so David starts counting the men, which causes God to be angry, because David's using it as a show of strength, of his power. Right? So this is maybe a check against the idea of the new Christ being a military power, is, maybe they should be careful and reread 1 Chronicles chapter 21, saying, oh, maybe we shouldn't look for him to be as a great military power, because we see that got David in trouble when he stopped it and said, oh yeah, let's start counting how powerful I am, and noting that. Maybe they should take better note of chapters like that.
He was trusting in the number of fighting men he had instead of trusting in God.
Yep. And then the rest of the book, at least the 1 Chronicles here, focuses more so on David and organizing the temple, of prescribing the worship in the temple, of organizing the Levites and the musicians and the ark, He even starts, David at this point, because of the census, buys the ground for the temple.
Yeah. I do have a question.
Let's hear it.
What is a threshing floor?
A threshing floor...
Because I'm always picturing like a mill or something,
yeah,
and I know it's not that.
It's the spot that you go and you beat the wheat and you separate it. So it's kind of like a big open space.
Open area by your field.
Yeah, and it could be maybe enclosed so stuff doesn't blow it, but it's where you go lay stuff out and you just literally beat the wheat out.
Because I'm always picturing them going to like this like the old fashioned mill next to the river kind of thing with the wheel going around. And, I'm always picturing that, and I know that's not the right picture, but that's what it makes me think of.
And that's something I'm not too keen up on that either. So it'd be something I'd have to look up and research a little bit more on myself.
But it is like an area by their field, basically.
Area, yeah. So he buys that for the temple space.
So this is up on that big hill next to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Now it's in Jerusalem.
Right.
At that time, it was outside of Jerusalem.
Yep. And so the spot that and they connect it to, of course, with that's the spot where Abraham offered up Isaac in Genesis 22. So the spot where all the sheep and all the sacrifices were done were also where Isaac was offered. So all this is connecting it to Jesus, who is the lamb that will be offered. So here David, he buys the spot for the temple. He gets all the materials ready for the temple. He prescribes all the worship for the temple. So really the only thing that David did not do
was actually build it.
Was actually build the temple. But we find out that everything, Solomon may be the one who built it, but David's fingerprints are just all over it in doing this. And First Chronicles wants to really focus on that because the prescribed worship in the temple is important. The rhythm, the communion that they have with God in the temple, where God has promised to put His name. Right, they're trying to remind themselves that this is where God is going to be for us. This is where our God, who is connecting us all the way back to the stories in the Old Testament to Adam and to Abraham. This is who our God is, and this is what He does for us. So that's all being kind of this is kind of assumed in the background of the text too. But yeah, anything that you kind of noticed in this section?
There's a lot more names again.
More names.
Which is important because it would be the descendants of these people would take up those duties again.
Yeah.
So the descendants of the Korites, Meshelemiah, the son of Korah, the sons of Asaph would be the gatekeepers.
Right.
And all these other names in here.
If you belong to Kohath, right, this is what your sons are going to be doing, and that's what you guys are now going to do. So it's kind of like, here's your assignment. Here, This is a call day a little bit here. This is where you guys are going to go and serve in God's house.
Which they took turns sharing, right? Because we find that out in Luke 1, where John the Baptist's father was his week or whatever to serve in the temple. Yeah,
and it seems like that's kind of when we get the intertestamental period too, that this stuff starts picking up more and more with them kind of organizing it this way as well. So
did the Israelites manage to keep faithful worship then after this? Basically, I mean, pagan worship didn't get back in.
Well, I mean, you trace in the Old Testament, so they come back, this is Ezra and Nehemiah, and this is about 516 BC when the temple's rebuilt, I think, if I remember correctly.
We need one of those bookmarks I have with all the dates.
Right, it's all in the fellowship hall. Because they go back home in 538 is when they go back home, and it takes about 20 years to rebuild the temple. So about 518 they rebuild the temple. You have Zechariah and Haggai talking to them, and as we get close to the end of the Old Testament here when we do the prophets, and they talk about with them of offering right sacrifices and coming back into faith and things like that as well. The prophet Malachi actually suggests that they fell into disorder again, because the prophet Malachi talks about how they're not offering right sacrifices, that they're cheap. The people are offering cheap, like, oh, this lamb has defect. Well, this can go to God. Instead of offering right sacrifices.
The whole going through the motions of it, but not the whole, what is it,
their heart's not in it.
Yeah, their hearts are far from me.
Yeah. In vain do these people worship me, right? Their heart, their mouths speak it, but their hearts are far from me, they teach the commandments of men. So and so Malachi actually accuses the people of doing it, and then the priest of being lax and loose too. So Malachi kind of suggests that they fell into a little bit of disorder with that. I'm sure there's periods of that going up and down.
Never got to the point of like because I guess they were never organized well enough as a nation, ever again to probably really screw up.
Right. Yeah. you do get in the Maccabean era there with the revolt there that the Greeks take over the temple for a time, and this is where we get the Hanukkah celebration there, that the temple was desecrated. Yep, and that Hanukkah is them restoring and cleansing the temple. So it does fall into disrepair.
They do it well, and I suppose Jesus overturns tables in the temple in his day,
which is his way of saying that this is done. Right?
Yeah.
This old temple is done because now it's fulfilled in me.
They're doing some
Yeah. So
anyway,
that's but important stuff when we talk about the temple.
Yeah.
And David once again is organizing the priests. He's telling them their services. Here's what they're doing. He spends a lot of time on that, which once again, maybe the back half of 2 Chronicles is a little bit dry because of that.
Which I think it's okay if you do start skimming a little bit of some of the names because,
right. It just. The major point that stands is this is important for them and how they conduct their service, and this is how they have communion with God. Because without this, there's no communion with God, and so this stuff is important for them.
It's like us reading 1 Corinthians and how Paul lays out how orderly worship and how communion's done properly and all that.
And that still has some implications for us too as we read this. That doesn't mean because it's not talking about us, right? We can just jettison this out because this does say that this is important. Then when we do enter into God with worship and when we enter into his presence, there is, substance that we need to be carrying.
There's a correct way to do it.
Right.
Even if it's not as strictly prescribed as as the Israelites had it, there still is a proper way to do it.
There's still implications we can gather from this that highlight things that we need to keep in mind with our day too. If they spend a whole book just on properly ordered worship,
Well, and 1 Corinthians where, he talks about orderly worship, that the Christian church is supposed to have orderly worship.
Yep.
It isn't. Yeah.
There should be an order of service.
Yes.
Yep. You bet. So good. That gets to the military divisions. Leaders of the tribes. Then of course you get to David's kind of some of his last words and his what he wants to see come out of this. So this kind of mimic there's David's charge to Israel. There's David prays in the assembly, and this kind of mimics a little bit of Jesus' prayer in the garden that we get in the Gospel of John a little bit when Jesus prays for his people, for his disciples, and then all who follow him, and then you get this a little bit with David because he's just gotten done with, and you can go back to Jesus. What did Jesus just get done instituting? The Lord's Supper. Right, so Jesus himself has prescribed a worship, right, a gathering around of his word and of his gifts, and then he goes off and prays, and David does that too here in 1 Chronicles. Where he's charged everyone. Here's what you're going to do in the temple. Here's how services are. Here's how you worship God. And then he then gives his farewells. He tells his son, "Here's what you're going to carry this on after me. Do this as often as you do it." There's kind of the David praise in the assembly of the people. Here's what I hope and pray for you guys as well. Solomon is anointed king there at the end in chapter 29.
Which this is where we actually get. David promising Solomon the kingship, which it's just kind of assumed at the beginning of
First Kings.
Yeah. It's just Bathsheba's you promised that Solomon was going to, and we never actually get that promise in Kings.
And here we do.
So here's actually where David promises that Solomon will be anointed after him.
Yep.
So.
And then Solomon's anointed king, and then David dies.
Yep.
And that's how 1 Chronicles comes to an end.
Yes. And then 2 Chronicles we'll get into Solomon for the first part, and then the kings of Judah after that, and
it'll be good.
So we're going to try to finish all of 2 Chronicles next week, even though we're actually taking 2 weeks to read it because there's a lot in 2 Chronicles, but because we need to do a what did I say, Colossians the week after that?
We do, yeah.
Because we'll need a whole week on Colossians and a whole week on Ezra and Nehemiah.
That'll be fun. That'll be good stuff.
Yeah.
Good. Anything else you can think of from 1 Chronicles that jumps out the page or we're missing here today?
I think we hit all the highlights.
Okay.
So it's a little easier book to talk about because it is a lot.
There's a lot of repeat.
It's a lot of genealogies.
Yep.
So you can kind of just talk about. You don't have to go chapter by chapter through every single name and number in here.
Right.
Yeah. But
we can if you want though. Start chapter 1.
Start reading
Adam,
these.
Shem. Yes.
Yeah. So.
That'd be fun, right? Let's just do a whole podcast where we just talk and read the names of the people.
Yeah. So.
Good.
Yeah. So I don't know. I think just that this this is them thinking their story is important, and we're also, again, a part of that story now.
Yeah.
So I know people sometimes try to throw out the whole Old Testament history and the Israelite history, but we are the descendants of Israel, even
If you kept
by spirit,
writing,
not by blood, but...
yeah, if you kept writing on the scroll, Dana, you'd eventually get to us. You know,
Yeah.
So good. We are tethered to something much bigger than us. And First and Second Chronicles is a good way for us to remember that too. That the Old Testament people saw themselves as that.
You're
as
part
well.
of a larger story.
Yeah.
It's not God brought our ancestors out of Egypt, it's God brought us out of Egypt,
Right.
and we could say that same thing too.
And God brought us out of Egypt too.
Yeah.
Here it is. And thanks be to God that through Christ He gives us the ultimate exodus. That's through His name. Good. Well, anything else you can think of for First Chronicles?
That's good.
Okay, me too. Well, let's do a final prayer and then we'll do a blessing. And dear God, Heavenly Father, we give thanks for your word, the word that connects us to all of your people, the word that calls us out of darkness and into your light. Lord, as we read First and Second Chronicles, we ask that you grant us your spirit, that we would see the hope that is to come in the future. As your people of old looked into the future, that you would grant us that same hope, that as we look to the past, as we look to your first coming in the manger that we celebrate next week, that we look forward in hope to your second coming, when you will finish all stories, and that you will wrap them all up, and that you will bring us to yourself. Lord, grant that to us all, for Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord look upon you with favor and give you peace. Amen.